The story of the Carians starts where most of magic's story in the Lands Between begin, on the mountaintops of the Giants, where a fledgling society of astrologers first lived in years past. Rennala is referred to as an astrologer in the Stargazer heirloom, which is how we know that she is descended from them. Chronologically, we first hear of the existence of these astrologers via the Sword of Night and Flame, a relic of the Carians, which reads as follows: Storied Sword and Treasure of Caria Manor. Astrologers who preceded the sorcerers established themselves in the mountaintops that nearly touched the sky, and considered the fire giants their neighbours. Notably, this sword is also described as a treasure of the Carians, and it's found in Caria Manor, reinforcing the fact that they do owe their lineage to these early astrologers and they honour it, a fact reinforced by the description of the preceptor set as well. We find evidence of this old society in the stone basins and the Stargazer ruins found on the mountaintops, the latter of which was presumably their home. Going by the account given in the sword, these astrologers lived peacefully in the mountains alongside the fire giants, meaning the development of this Proto-Liurnian society very much predates the Erdtree dominion. I presume most are aware of this, but for those who aren't, these early Stargazers are the ancestors to the Glintstone sorcerers, as is said in the sword description we just read, but it's also reinforced via the Carian preceptor set, which reads the following: A long, bright blue gown with the movements of the stars drawn upon it, worn by the magic preceptors who served the Carian royals. Glintstone sorcerers are the descendants of astrologers, a fact that the Carians remain aware of, even if their fate has long been severed from the stars. It is very interesting to me that the Carians do have this habit of remembering and lauding their ancestry, no doubt a practice enforced by Rennala, who herself was an astrologer. And of course, recording and preserving one's lineage is important for monarchies in the real world as well. Of course, the other reason the Carians still likely care about astrology is that they are fully aware of how important fate is, especially to them.
The stars alter the fate of the Carian Royal Family, and the fate of your mistress, Rani.
My understanding of the settlement of Liurnia and Raya Lucaria is that Raya Lucaria predates the rise of the Carians as a royal family, and they developed independently of one another. I mainly take this from the specific wording of her remembrance, which reads the following: In her youth, Rennala was a prominent champion who charmed the academy with her lunar magic, becoming its master. She also led the Glintstone Knights and established the House of Caria as royalty. The fact she made this discovery in her youth and then charmed the academy reinforces the idea that the Raya Lucarian Academy was already an established facility by the time Rennala came to prominence. And indeed, momentarily we will examine the history of Raya Lucaria, which predates the rise of Caria, when we look at founding OG members like Lusat and Azur. But returning to the Carian preceptor set, the astrologers are the ancestors of those who would become Glintstone sorcerers, the sorcerers we find in Raya Lucaria. And so we do have to fill in the gap a little bit when it comes to the transition from this astrologer society on the mountain to the Glintstone sorcerers of the Liurnian Basin. However, it is clear that in time the descendants of astrologers moved from the study of the sky to the study of Glintstone, a material which makes one's position relative to the sky less of a pressing issue. Indeed, if you take a look at Liurnia's landscape, we can see that it is a huge source of glintstone, both above ground and beneath it, and thus it makes sense that these adherents of the stars would gravitate towards this region. Indeed, even now, a glintstone mine lies underneath Raya Lucaria, in the form of the Academy Crystal Cave, and as we learn from the Shatter Earth sorcery description, glintstone mining is very central to their culture. It is the foundation of it, with the failures of the Academy still being useful to that ecosystem by doing the dangerous job of mining glintstone that can be studied by their betters. And while the glintstone sorcerers are the descendants of astrologers, there has to be some overlap. The astrologers didn't completely cease to be, although their community on the mountaintops does seem to have been a thing of the past. As I said earlier, it seems that Rennala was still part of an astrologer community, even after Raya Lucaria must have been established, because in her youth she meets her moon, and then not long after she goes to the academy and charms it. Rennala's early history as part of this astrologer community, and her meeting the moon that would change her life, is best explored by the item Stargazer Heirloom, which reads the following. The young astrologer gazed at the night sky as she walked. She had always chased the stars every step of her journey. Then she met the full moon, and in time, the astrologer became a queen. The obvious conclusion that we have to come to then, with this overlap, is that Rennala's community was either the last to come down from the mountaintops, or was simply the last to give up that way of life, whilst others had long become glintstone sorcerers. Loki has an interesting perspective on this gradual migration from the mountaintops, something shown by this map here. Loki believes that we can trace the migration pattern of the astrologers through the trees, the suggestion being that each migration of astrologers brought large conifers with them to their new home. We can see these ghost conifers on the mountaintops of the giants, the astrologers' original home. We can also see dead ones at Lascar Ruins in South Liurnia, where they clearly migrated to, and in Celia, and of course Moonlight Altar, where the Carians would eventually migrate to. We can also find them in the area around the Shifra River, and in the Hallowhorn grounds which lie above the Shifra River. Given that both of these areas surround the city of Nokron, Loki suggests that the conifer's presence here is because of a contact between Celia and Nokron, which we of course know exist, given Celia's deep ties to the Eternal City, and the Nox. My main issue with this is that I personally see Celia as more culturally Nox or Numen, though I believe Loki isn't discounting this either. Rather, Loki sees the town of Celia as the result of a sort of cross-pollination, that astrologers settled down here in Caelid and made contact with the Nox. And while the establishment of Celia above ground is definitely because of the Noxian influence, he believes that the population here are mainly astrologer descendants, and I do think this certainly makes sense given that we only see 2 true Nox in this town, and the rest appear like normal glintstone sorcerers. But I really like this theory of Loki regarding the conifers and the migration patterns of the astrologers, and I think it helps illustrate the evolution of the astrologer community to their glintstone descendants, via conifers that are primarily found on the mountaintops of the giants, but also these conifers are found in areas related to glintstone sorcery, such as Moonlight Altar, Lascar Ruins, and Celia. But to conclude, whilst a lot of her astrologer kin had already become glintstone sorcerers, Rennala was still part of the astrologer tradition. But once again, I think Loki puts it in a more concise way, and so once again I will quote Loki's notes to me on this subject. The Carians are still living on the mountaintops during Rennala's youth and migrate down while she is still relatively young. The Lascar and Celia already have a lengthy history, with the academy under Azur and Lusat. In short, they establish themselves as nobles on the western mountain and become royalty within a short number of years. But the power dynamic would shift when she met this cosmic entity, the full moon, that would come to define her and her rule henceforth. So as we've just learned from the Stargazer Heirloom, as a young astrologer, Rennala was essentially observing the stars, and at this point she made contact with the moon. Where this fateful meeting took place, for me, is most likely to be Moonlight Altar, mainly because the location has a deep connection to the moon specifically. Despite this altar not being the highest point in the lands between, one is able to see the moon far more clearly than in any location, a place where we can see the full moon and the dark moon in the sky simultaneously, unlike in other areas of the map, even just below us, in Liurnia, which means it most likely has a special connection to the moon. And if this was where Rennala first made contact, it would make sense that this is where a Moonlight Altar would be established. We learn that Rennala tries to recreate her own meeting with her moon with her daughter Ranni, and this is something we learn of via Ranni's dark moon, which reads as follows. This moon was encountered by a young Ranni, led by the hand of her mother, Rennala. What she beheld was cold, dark, and veiled in occult mystery. Given that the full moon is foundational to Rennala's power, and she sees Ranni as her heir, this makes total sense. But returning to Moonlight Altar, given it is one of the only places in the lands between that we can see the dark moon and the full moon in the sky simultaneously, it does lead me to believe that this is where Rennala led Ranni to meet her own moon, and it is where originally Rennala met her moon. With that in mind, let us consider the archaeology of Moonlight Altar and what it can tell us about the early history of the Carians. Firstly, there are two sets of ruins that can be found on the altar in the shadow of the cathedral, the Lunar Estate and the Moonfolk ruins. As I stated in my Hidden Tales video, I attribute the Lunar Estate to be the estate of the Carian family, prior to them living in Caria Manor. The term estate in the real world, in Britain, is usually used to denote land owned by a royal or aristocratic family, and so I see this as the old Carian estate, the Lunar Estate. The Stargazer heirloom states that in time Rennala became a queen, and given she was very young when she met the moon, it is a reasonable assumption that a good deal of time passed between her meeting the full moon and establishing the Carians as a royal family. She would attend the Raya Lucaria Academy as a young sorceress, charm them with her unique magic, and then in time build up her power base, before eventually declaring herself as monarchy, when she had enough power of course. And the foundation of that power I think can be found here in the Moonlight Altar. And as such, I would imagine this lunar estate to be her family's home during this transitionary period, established at the site of the most important meeting of her life. Likewise, I would see the Moonfolk ruins as the ruins of a community who followed Rennala and joined her in the veneration of the moon. There is another feature of interest to this story, found on Moonlight Altar, and this is what I call the Three Sister statues, which are guarded by a Red Wolf of Radagon. Now, we are never directly told what these statues represent, but the statues of the three female figures immediately makes me think of the Three Sisters found at Caria Manor. These towers are called Renna, Ranni, and Selvis's Rise. Selvis's Rise is clearly named after the current occupant. However, given this area is called the Three Sisters, I speculate that this is only a recent renaming of the tower, and that at one stage it was also named after a female. Therefore, speculatively, there might have been three sisters, of which Ranni was just one, multiple Carian princesses. Indeed, the description of the Carian filigreed crest does imply there were multiple Carian princesses, and while it is speculation, I do think this is the story that is being told to us through the environmental details, and is just another tie to the Carians, suggesting that this was their earlier home, predating Caria Manor. Then of course we have the cathedral, the Manus Celeste itself, and as Ziostorm points out in his video on Moonlight Altar, this cathedral shares the same architectural design as the Church of Vows, marking it as a Carian structure, really being the final piece of evidence that Moonlight Altar is Carian. The translation of the Latin Manus Celeste that people have provided within the community does vary, but the two most likely translations are the Hand of God or Hidden Hand. The cathedral itself is shattered, and spread throughout the ruined fragments of the cathedral are starlight shards. Additionally, in the sky we can see blue streaks, suggesting that starfall has damaged the cathedral here, and this is something suggested by Ziostorm. And while I agree that the cathedral itself was damaged by a starfall, I don't agree with the common notion that the two fingers found beneath the cathedral came down as a sort of meteor, and people usually cite the different blue colorization of these fingers and the blue streaks in the sky as evidence for this. One of my main reasons for not agreeing with it, and again this is pointed out by Ziostorm in his video, is that the crater or channel that leads down to the two fingers is not a straight up and down line. The passage that leads to the two fingers under here actually travels horizontally a fair bit, and so if it was a straight meteor site, you'd think it would just be a straight up and down channel. And more importantly, I think the name of the cathedral, the Hand of God or Hidden Hand, is actually named after the two fingers, meaning it is built after the two fingers arrived here. And this would discount the notion that the two fingers sort of crashed through the roof of the cathedral, because I don't think it would have been built until after the two fingers had appeared. So if the cathedral was built in honour of the two fingers as I'm suggesting, this really clashes with Ranni's future view of the two fingers and the greater will. Ranni would later come to despise her connection to the fingers, but perhaps at the time it was a cause of celebration for the Carians. After all, their heir, their princess, had just been granted Empyrean status. There is one other fact of importance that is relevant when discussing Moonlight Altar and this early community of the Carians, and that is the connection to the Eternal Cities, specifically Noxtella. The passageway that now acts as the den of the fearsome Astel is sealed with the seal of the Carians, marking it as their passageway, and this passageway ultimately acts as an underground highway to Noxtella. And this makes sense because the Eternals and the Carians do have some cultural overlaps, most overtly seen in the Church of Vows. This church literally houses statues that can also be found in the Eternal Cities. But more importantly, the actual main function of this church is the basin, and this is actually a statue of a Noxian swordstress, and it requires you to use Celestial Dew. And as the description of the Celestial Dew tells us, this is an invention of the Nox. And so this absolutely speaks to contact between the Carians and the Nox, and is a nice detail when looking at their cultural and ideological development, as the tunnels at Moonlight Altar that lead to the Eternal Cities speak to this sort of contact. So to summarise, I see the Moonlight Altar as the first bastion of Carian influence, when they were more concerned with the power of the moon, and before they became associated with Erdtree royalty. As for why they abandoned this significant location, well, there are a couple of speculative ideas that I have. Firstly, there is the possibility that this region became less significant and more isolated as the land in Liurnia fell away. After all, we're only able to actually access this area by passing through the Eternal Cities. There is no direct route for Liurnia, and as someone who is the monarch of Liurnia, basing yourself in a location that can't even access the lands that you rule is really not a strategic advantage. And so perhaps when the lands fell away and the Lake of Liurnia was created, the Carians looked for a new location from which to rule from. It could also be a shift in priorities. When she got married to Radagon and they had children together, and her alliance with the Erdtree family obviously strengthened, perhaps she was less concerned with her old ways of venerating the moon, and she cared more about maintaining her alliance and her marriage. And Caria Manor's location is definitely closer to Altus Plateau, and if there was an ongoing alliance between these two houses, it would make sense to relocate somewhere closer to Altus Plateau. So while we've discussed Rennala's consolidation of a power base, we also need to talk about her influence in another area, and this is of course in Raya Lucaria, an institution that she would come to dominate, and is definitely one of the pillars of her rule. So let's talk about that. As we've already mentioned, Rennala was able to charm people at the Raya Lucaria Academy because of her unique magic, and when you look at the history of sorcery in the lands between, this certainly makes sense, because Rennala's moon magic would have been like nothing anyone had seen before. The Lazuli Conspectus mask, which represents the school that was founded to study Carian magic, shines a light on this, as it reads, "Scholars of the Lazuli Conspectus study Carian sorceries, a heterodox pursuit that views the moon as equal to the stars." So this means that moon magic is unorthodox, and it was no doubt this unique nature that led to Rennala becoming so prominent to the stage where she is honoured in paintings, alongside other alumni. It's not just the uniqueness of her magic though, Rennala is of course a very competent sorceress in other regards. A point well made by Loki in his notes to me is that Rennala, in stage 2 of her fight with us, which is presumably Ranni recreating her glory days, she is able to use Azur's Comet, showing that while she eventually banned the primeval sorcerers from the academy, she was certainly capable of using their most powerful spells. And so with the combination of her raw talent and this unique type of sorcery that clearly blew away the academy and revolutionised its way of thinking, it's no surprise that she would become governess of the academy, a fact we can learn from Miriel, who names her as such. Rennala and her brand of Carian magic eventually claiming dominance over the academy had quite a few consequences. Firstly, of course, it is definitely a huge win for her. It is a consolidation of power, and no doubt helped her legitimacy when she established herself as royalty. And we will learn about other things that she did to consolidate her power base in the next chapter, when we look at her forces and allies, but of course claiming dominance over the Academy is a massive feather in her cap. But of course it would gain her enemies, as there must have been an existing power structure in the Academy before Rennala took full control. Because while Rennala became the sole governor or ruler of Raya Lucaria, it seems that before her, there were Grand Masters, a term coined in the robes of Azure and Lusat, two sorcerers that she would ultimately oust. It is of course Rennala who dismantled the power base of those known as the primeval sorcerers, something we can learn via Selen's personal enmity of the Carians.
If you recall, I was exiled from the Academy of Raya Lucaria. It was for attempting to restore the primeval current of glintstone sorcery. The toothless pedantry peddled by the Carian Royal Family can rot for all I care. I want glintstone sorceries that open our minds, unbound by terrestrial taboos.
Even to this day, the Carians are still trying to wipe out this school of sorcery, because Selen is being hunted by Jeren, a retainer of the Carians, and presumably the one responsible for chaining up her true body in the Witchbane ruins, no doubt intending to return the moment the stars started moving again and she could be killed for good. And while Selen is the most recent heir of this school, she isn't the one that founded this. In fact, this can be traced back to two of the oldest glintstone sorcerers in existence, Lusat and Azure.
I need your help, my apprentice. Master Lusat is another founding glintstone sorcerer, and like Master Azure, he was banished from the Academy. Now he languishes in prison somewhere. My apprentice, can you find Master Lusat? With this glintstone key, you should be able to cross the boundary that encloses him. I need him to restore the primeval current of glintstone sorcery. He's nigh a child of the stars. Such is his body now.
Rennala's reasons for banishing this school of sorcerers is never explicitly stated. However, as always, we are able to speculate with the evidence given to us. Firstly, the methods used by Selen and her predecessors are extremely dangerous and pretty abhorrent. And this is of course how Selen earned her moniker, Selen the Graven Witch. The term Graven is a reference to the so-called Graven Schools or Graven Mass, a horrifying abomination that we can learn of via the Graven Mass talisman, which reads, "The primeval current is a forbidden tradition of glintstone sorcery. To those who cleave to its teachings, the act of collecting sorcerers to fashion them into seeds of the stars is but another path of scientific inquiry." We can find these horrifying abominations throughout the lands between, tortured beings, and we can even find a dead one in Raya Lucaria itself, in a room where we find Azure's staff, suggesting that he created one within the halls of the Academy itself. Imagine bonding humans together into this Frankenstein ball, within the very halls of the Academy itself. This no doubt would have caused a lot of discord and resentment. Indeed, the dialogue from Top suggests that Selen's expulsion from the Academy was indeed tied to her graven habits.
Selen was well known. The most promising sorceress in the history of the Academy. I followed her at school. But there may as well have been an ocean between us. But Selen was expelled from the Academy, accused of unthinkable treatment of certain sorcerers, under the name of the Graven Witch. I still don't believe the accusations. The illustrious Selen would never do such things.
Seems pretty straightforward. However, I do think there is another consequence of exiling these sorcerers, and that is that Rennala got rid of some potential political opponents and solidified her control over the Academy. Selen describes both Lusat and Azure as founding glintstone sorcerers, heavily implying that these sorcerers are some of the OGs, sorcerers who not only helped found Raya Lucaria, but helped build the foundations of glintstone sorcery itself. Indeed, this seems more or less certain when we consider the Carolus Crown, which names this school as the oldest, and this school was founded by none other than Azure. So we really are talking about the old guard here, legends who helped build the very foundations of the Academy and sorcery in general. To reinforce their prestigious position that they once held, we can look to their robes, which read the following: Since the Grand Masters Azur and Lusat were driven from the Academy, no one has achieved their formerly held rank. So Azur and Lusat were Grand Masters, a position which hasn't been held since they were expelled, and this makes sense if it coincided with Rennala taking control as Governor, a position that essentially made the role of Grand Masters worthless, and it changed the control of the Academy from an oligarchy of these OGs to an effective monarchy. Raya Lucaria thus transformed under Rennala. Her school of magic, her brand of magic, would become its own conspectus, the Lazuli. Founding your own school is really the mark of being a great sorcerer, and again the fact that she is able to do this with her own unique brand of sorcery would definitely have helped solidify her claim to governess of the Academy. Selin describes Carian magic as toothless pedantry, a reflection of the fact that under her rule, under Rennala's rule, there was no research into the primeval current, which people like Selin see as the ultimate end goal of glintstone sorcery as a whole, and thus practicing magic without this end goal in mind is toothless. And so with this clash in ideals and the political aspect of it, it is no wonder that Rennala would get rid of these sorcerers from the Academy, and with it, her control was secure. Thank you so much for watching this short Elden Ring lore video. This lore video is a segment from a much larger and longer video on my main channel, and a link to the full video can be found in the description. If you are interested in more Elden Ring lore content, then be sure to subscribe here and on my main channel Smowtown. But until next time, I will see you in the lands between.